Again, welcome everyone to this Transforming Business Education conversation. We're honored to have David Sloan Wilson with us. David does not require much introduction, but he is one of the most prominent biologists, evolutionists, I think is maybe the more accurate term. And David, you can speak to that. You have probably read some of his books on altruism, how evolution works, and other books that are in some way not necessarily directly related to business education, but you can see how they are connected to the notion of who we are as human beings and what we can learn from the science of biology, from evolution, from those theories about how we survive, how we thrive as a species. And therefore, I think it's an apt kind of framework, and David will talk more about it that in his latest book, This View of Life, etc. He has proposed a number of ways how we can make this evolutionist perspective a general perspective on life, and that will also hold true for business. And I know that, David, you have done a number of studies on understanding businesses and how they organize in groups, in small groups, also with Eleanor Ostrom and others that you are familiar with probably on the call here. And so there are very interesting insights that can be generated that contradict the traditional way of how we view businesses and business education. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to David. Thank you for being with us. And if you want to share slides, please feel free to do so. And everyone else, welcome on this call.
Okay, great. Can you hear me, Michael, and everyone else?
Yes. If you have it, pump it up, it might be good too, because I think there's...
Okay, there it is. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit better. Honored to be with you all. Eager to get to know you as I'm getting to know Michael. And Michael, how long would you like my comments to be? I could make them as long or short as needed. We want plenty of room for Q&A, so how long should I speak?
10, 15 minutes. Take as much as you think you need for stimulating a conversation. I think the comments and the questions will come in, and yeah, I trust your instinct.
Okay, so I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. Altruism and cooperation in all of its forms, how groups evolve to function well, has been my topic from the beginning. I've studied it in non-human species and have had an interest in expanding evolution to include all things human, in addition to the biological sciences, where it was confined for most of the 20th century. Started to actually take this out to the real world about 10 years ago when I co-founded the Evolution Institute, which is essentially a think tank for formulating public policy from an evolutionary perspective. I got onto the subject of economics almost immediately, and so I've been immersed in economics all those years, and then business and management more specifically, I would say about 5 years ago. And once again, when I do something like this, I do try to take a deep dive to develop a professional level of competence, and I hope that's the own goals that I set for myself in the case of business and management. The common denominator for all of this is what is required for any group to function as a cooperative a unit. And for that, there is, I think, really a solid body of theory that has become established, which can be applied to real-world settings of all sorts. It's based on something called multi-level selection, which basically means that life, including human life, consists of a nested tier of units, groups within groups, and humans, everything from individuals to businesses and corporations to governmental bodies, all the way up to the whole earth. And in each of these cases, there is a potential for disruptive competition within groups, which undermines the function of the group. And in order for the groups to function well, then they have to be designed for teamwork. And the way that evolves is a process of competition at a larger scale, between group competition rather than within group competition. And so this actually is a balance of competition and cooperation that's combined in an interesting way, which is it's quite fascinating. It's not just like competition is good, period. That's too naive. And it's also not cooperation is good, period. It's more nuanced than that, a lot more nuanced than that. But what it provides is a kind of a blueprint that can be applied at all scales, starting at relatively small groups and then working its way up towards multi-group society. I think one reason that this framework is new is because of competing narratives. And of course, in economics, we have the narrative of Homo economicus, rational choice theory, individualism, as if we have to explain everything in terms of self-interest, individual self-interest, utility maximizing, the metaphor of the invisible hand, which pretends that if the lower level pursuit of self-interest benefits the, robustly benefits the common good. Hold on, I'm just going to shut my door for a minute. Just one moment, please. And so orthodox economic theory has had a huge impact on management. You don't need me to tell you that. And so the whole ethos that the only responsibility of the corporation is to maximize short-term profits for its shareholders and all of that is something which was imported into business largely through the advent of business schools. So here we get back to the business school curriculum. And there's a quote from the economist Herbert Ginchis that I love to quote. I won't do so in full, but it's just like, before World War II, all these business schools started up. Before that, there were no business schools. Businessmen were just businessmen. And if they went to college, it wasn't to learn business. But now we have business schools, and they wanted to be professionals, and so they started to teach economics. And economics tells us that greed is good. And so that kind of became script for a lot of business schools. And you can comment on that. So one narrative basically for economics, which carries over to business, is laissez-faire. Basically, just the lower level pursuit of self-interest is going to be good for the economy and society as a whole. The other narrative is centralized planning, basically, that a group of experts can figure out what to do and implement it. And centralized planning not only exists at the national scale, where we know it doesn't work, also exists at the corporate scale, where we know it doesn't work. And again, you guys are the experts. I'm the outsider, but I have read and I have been told that top-down management basically typically fails more often than it succeeds. And why is that? It's because even a modernist group, such as a company, is too complex to know exactly what's going to work. There will be unforeseen consequences. And that's why top-down centralized planning doesn't work. So if laissez-faire doesn't work, and if centralized planning doesn't work, what does work? A managed process of cultural evolution. We have to make our most informed guesses, that we have to implement something, we have to see if it works, and then we have to try it again and again and again. It has to be inherently experimental in nature, and whenever we make a change, we have to look at the systemic consequences. And for examples of that, we should turn to the business and management literature, because not all companies, but many companies actually have figured out a way to do this. So the idea of organizations which are not only well adapted to their environments, but adaptable to changing environments is something that we can understand scientifically, but also has evolved, basically culturally evolved many times in the world. Toyota is a shining example. And there are others. I've just recently made the acquaintance of Charles O'Reilly, a business professor at the Stanford Business School. And he, with co-authors, have done an extensive analysis of IBM as an organization which does two things well. One is its existing operation, but also entering new businesses. They managed to function as a massive startup in addition to carrying on their current enterprises. And the way they do that, according to O'Reilly, is that he calls them ambidextrous, because what it takes for an organization to do what it's currently doing well is different than what it takes to foresee the future and plan for the future. And that's why I've learned through him, through some of his writing. Again, I feel like I'm a outsider talking to the experts. Isn't it astonishing that the vast majority of operations do not last more than 40 years? How does that work? That while they exist, they have everything going for them. They've got the revenue, they've got the expertise, all of that, and yet it's very unusual for a corporation to survive more than 40 years. It's because they're well adapted to what they're currently doing, but they're not adaptable to changing environments. That's where the so-called creative destruction takes place. So just to wrap this up, I wanted to present two slides and then turn it over to a Q&A. So Michael mentioned that I've worked with Elinor Ostrom, who was the political scientist who Nobel Prize in 2009, and I was fortunate to work with her for 2-3 years before her death in 2012. What she did, as some of you might well know, is she studied the famous tragedy of the commons, the propensity of when people are drawing upon a common pool of resource to overexploit it, basically. And economic wisdom held that the tragedy would always occur unless you could privatize the resource or manage it in a top-down fashion. And what Lynn showed by actually studying common pool resource groups is that some, not all, were capable of successfully avoiding the tragedy of the commons, managing their common pool resource, could do it on their own, but only if they possess certain what you call design features. And so that's what won her the Nobel Prize, basically, was to come up with, you might say, the blueprint or the recipe for these groups to successfully manage their common pool resources. And what I did with her was to generalize these principles, to show that they're all about cooperation, basically. Cooperation is a common pool resource. And so all groups need these core design principles, including businesses. And I'll share some of the work that I've done with businesses in the second slide. But first, let's look at these core design principles. And then you can just think of them with businesses in mind. So what she showed was that the groups at work have a strong group sense of identity and purpose. They know that they're a group. They know that what they're doing, that it's important. There's a number two, a fair distribution of costs and benefits. It's not sustainable for some people to do all the work and other people to do all the benefits. Number three, decision-making needs to be fair and inclusive. Won't work if some people get to make the decisions and other people are not a part of that process. Number four, monitoring agreed upon behaviors. You have to know if you're doing what you agreed upon to do. Number five, graduated sanctions for misbehaviors. If you're not doing what you're supposed to do, something needs to be done about it, but it needn't be harsh at the beginning. It can be friendly at first, yet it must escalate as necessary. And also that there needs to be positive reinforcement, praise for good behavior, in addition to sanctions against bad behavior. Number six, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur. They need to be resolved quickly and in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. Most parties in a dispute think they have a point of view, and that needs to be respected. Number 7, authority to self-govern. A group must have elbow room to do what it is supposed to do. If it's being dictated from the outside, then that's not going to work. And the Catholic principle of subsidiarity captures that design principle well. Finally, appropriate relations with other groups, which basically embodies the same design principle. So this is enormously important, that these principles are scale independent. They're required for relations among groups in addition to relations within groups. And so the prediction is that these core design principles are needed by all groups. You might say especially business groups, because the business environment is so competitive. And so here's some data that I'm gathering with one of my PhD students. This is based on a very short survey in which we ask the participant to bring a group to mind that they know well, a group that's important to them, need not function well, can function poorly, and then to basically provide information about how well that group functions and how well it implements the core design principles. So it's a very simple survey, and of course it's only a start, but it's very interesting in what it says. And so what we see here on the x-axis is a aggregate score for how well a group implements the core design principles. On the y-axis, we have a measure of group performance, in this case trust, but we have 4 measures of how well the group works, and they all more or less look like this. First thing you see is like a great fit. Okay, so basically there's a very strong correlation between how well a group works and how well it implements the core design principles. The participants were asked to do this twice, by the way. Once for a business group, a place of employment, that's the blue dots, and once for any other group of their choice. So this enables us to compare business groups with other groups. And so a great fit, that's point 1. Point 2 is that you see that the business groups fall on the same regression line as the other groups. And so this seems to confirm the idea that there's nothing at all special about business groups with respect to their need for the core design principles. And then the third point is that while there's plenty of groups up on the high end of that regression line, as we work our way down to the low end, we see now an overabundance of business groups. So all things considered, there's something business groups which are especially lacking in the core design principles. And I have additional slides showing which ones are especially deficient. The most deficient one is authority to self-govern. Basically, people are typically not allowed to do their job as they think it should best be done. That's an extremely common problem. Another common problem is number 1, a shared sense of identity and purpose. That's often lacking. Decision-making is often lacking, and so on, and so forth. So I'll in just a few minutes. When I read the business literature, which I find a business and management literature, which I find a totally fascinating literature, the design principles and the need for them it's so obvious from the literature itself. It's as if another study doesn't need to be done. I'm fond of quoting a book called The Human Equation by the business professor Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford University, in which he just talks about how basically fair employee practices is so good for businesses, right? Which would fall under proportional costs and benefits. He cited a study there that followed a cohort of businesses from the time they went public on the stock exchange so that you could gather information about them for a 5-year period. And he showed that just the survival of the companies, whether they existed 5 years later, depended heavily on how well they did by their employees. And it's like so in your face, so obvious when you read the actual empirical literature on business organizations that the real wonder is why it's not obvious from the start. And for that, I think we have to thank this neoliberal worldview, which is has been so dominating. Now, where I'll end up is that in my position as president of the Evolution Institute, I've kind of made business a focus and gathered my own social network of people to rethink business from an evolutionary perspective. It includes this plus more, by the way. There's all sorts of insights having to do with such things as mismatch theory, the idea that when modern environments become sufficiently different from ancestral environments, then all kinds of problems can surface. And so the food we eat, the physical architecture of buildings, the physical environment, sleep cycles, artificial lighting, the need for natural vegetation. I mean, it goes on, way beyond these kinds of cooperation things that I am focusing on. And so what that means is that in some ways I have my own initiative to read business from an evolutionary perspective, which I'm very eager to integrate with other initiatives. And of course, that's why we're here. So I think that's probably a good way for me to end.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And I see a number of questions popping up. I am keen to let people that put their questions in ask the question themselves. Alim, are you there? Can you unmute? Can you ask the question that you have?
And please also introduce yourself to me, because hardly any of you, so I would very much appreciate it.
Are you there? Alim is asking the question, at what level is the choice to cooperate or compete made? Is it at the gene level, at the individual level, group norms, or structural factors? Where do you see in the multi-level perspective? I assume everywhere, but
all of the above would be the answer to that. Yes, there's genetic propensities, and there's fascinating literature on that. For example, one study I have in mind compared people with what's called a dominance orientation and a prestige orientation. Some people just want control, basically. Other people want to be respected. And there's individual differences. No doubt it's heritable. Everything is. And it makes a big difference as to who's a leader, as to whether they have a dominance orientation or a prestige orientation. My colleague, Mark van Vugt, who's a social psychologist in the Netherlands, who's writes a lot about management, has written a book about leadership from an evolutionary perspective called Naturally, in which he makes this distinction between two kinds of leadership: the authoritarian kind, which we don't want, and the authoritative kind, which is consensus based and shares governance and so on. So yes, there's propensities, but at the same time, each and every individual is flexible. Each and every individual is flexible, and the importance of the core design principles is that they provide the structure. There's the structure part that more or less it determines who's going to succeed. So if you imagine a group that implements the core design principles strongly, and if you put in a disruptive person into that group, it probably won't work very well for them. There's too many controls, basically. Whereas a pro-social person, someone who's cooperative, will enter that social environment, and they'll see that they can give freely and that they will share in the benefits. And so anyone who is other-oriented is going to basically open up and express that part. So you need the structure. The structure provides the kind of social environment which causes cooperation to succeed or fail. And at that point, then that interacts with individuals and their own propensities, which does have a genetic component, and yet everyone is flexible, at least to a degree.
Okay, wonderful. You mentioned governance, so I'm going to ask Shan Turnbull if you're on to unmute yourself and ask one brief question. Shan?
My first question was: are humans the only species on the planet that uses command and control hierarchies to manage complex tasks? Where Ellen Ostrom, rather than networks with distributed control and governance, like you find in companies like Visa International, the Mondragon Cooperatives, and the John Lewis Partnership in England?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. Does any other species employ command
and control, centralized control, where in nature, what Eleanor Ostrom found in pre-modern society is always network governance?
Yeah. And so, I mean, one point to make is that a lot of animal societies are despotic. And so that's top down because the biggest bastard that's the alpha male, or the biggest bastard that's the alpha female.
No, I'm not talking about singles. I'm talking about large groups like ants and bees.
Yeah, well, that's always distributed.
Exactly.
Always distributed. So there's the answer. There's the short answer to your question. And so the idea that human governance needs to be like that to a degree is, for the most part, yes. And so I think that's very much what we want to work towards and to have represented in business schools. Part of the new business school education should be that. Let me just say one other thing about that, which is that I have heard and read, and certainly makes a lot of sense, that when teamwork is introduced into business corporations, in the first place, it's usually introduced only at the lower levels, not at the higher levels. It tends to work at the lower levels, as you would expect, but the problem is it's up to the higher levels. And so you have something that works nested underneath something that doesn't work. And the challenge is to actually be more systemic in terms of implementing that kind of governance from top to bottom, which is often hard to do. Is that also your experience?
Certainly. Michael and I have written about half a dozen articles on what we call network governance, where you've got to change the constitution of the company. I know of no business school in the world, or of management or of government, that teaches how to design distributed control, changing the constitutions of organizations to create what Eleanor Ostrom called polycentric compound republics, which is illustrated by the Mondragon Cooperatives, the John Lewis Partnership, and Visa International. So it's an intellectual gap.
Yes, and so there we go. I mean, I think that's a giant step. And please, can we establish a one-on-one correspondence? I don't even have your name in front of me. So who are you again?
My name's Shan Turnbull. I'm resident in Sydney, Australia. It's about 2:30 a.m. in the morning here. And it's Michael, who is my co-author, who we've published journal articles on this. And one just got published this week about the future of management network governance, is published by the European Financial Review.
I'll make sure you get connected, because I do think there is a lot of overlap there, and that can.
Okay, and please forgive me. I want to apologize to all of you for not already knowing you, because I know that you are all distinguished in your own areas, and so it's let me make that blanket apology. As it turns out, the Evolution Institute is just starting to work with the Mondragon Collective, and we're having a summit with them in just about a month, which is quite exciting. And so I'd be happy to share that with you as one of many initiatives. But just so, yeah, we're page.
My PhD was on Mondragon, and I've lectured to them of how their system is unwittingly follows the laws of nature.
Oh, awesome. Well, okay, well, we have so much to talk about then.
Okay, so that is for a separate conversation. We have a number of other folks here very interested, engaged in the conversation. So I'd like to call up Ravi Chinta, can you unmute? Ravi?
Yes, I'm here.
Brief question if you can. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is very simple. When I listen to you, I'm reminded of harmony and diversity concepts. Those are not hard to understand. Oriental spiritualism. In business terms, harmony is about alignment and peaceful and trusting coexistence with all stakeholders. And diversity is all about embracing new and innovative ways of doing. In business, we teach the students about how to create value creating systems that renew themselves all the time and keeping in the right pace of change, which aligns, which is what alignment is all about. And the end result is to create systems that are sustainable and making the world much greener and for future generations. So my question to you would be, what's the right balance between consumption in the present and savings for the future? One for me in the present, one for the future generations, a 50-50 percentage. Is that too much to aim for? If we produce something, maybe give half of it for future generations or allocate those resources for greener, ecologically conservative, corporate social responsibility needs. What would be the right balance? That's the question to you.
Well, that's I'm really happy that you brought in some aspects of spirituality into this. And these principles are so general, as you can see. I mean, starting out with non-human species and then extending to all forms of human society, therefore religion. And before I studied economics or business, I studied religion and wrote a book called Darwin's Cathedral on religion from an evolutionary perspective. What spirituality and religion is, and of course existing in spirituality existing in non-religious formulations is totally fascinating and relevant to secular organizations such as business and management schools and business and business groups of all sorts. And so let me just flag that. But one thing that spirituality does is it creates a sense in which, of course, it subordinates you to something larger. The whole concept of the sacred is that you place something above you. And that state of mind is, of course, conducive to the group functioning well because it lowers the dissonance between the individual interests and the group interests. If you really have in your mind a sense of your own interests, which is different than the group interest, then to cooperate requires an alignment. But on the other hand, if you've taken on the group interest as your interest, and this is sometimes called identity fusion, there is a scientific literature on it, then of course the functioning as a cooperator in that group is much simpler. And so the degree to which that can be employed by business organizations, the answer is yes, it can, and often it is, because of course there's a lot of variation there also. And I have another colleague I'm working with named Jeff Ganong, who is down in Austin and who is very much interested in what he calls contemplative business practices. And he's also, we're starting to work in the healthcare section, possibly working with the Ascension healthcare system, which will be very interesting indeed. I don't mean to be so long-winded. I should keep my answers short, along with the questions short. But thank you for bringing the whole dimension, basically, of religion, spirituality, contemplation, mindfulness, basically. And I can't resist saying that I work very closely with psychologists who work on mindfulness-based therapy, which is right next door to spiritual practices. These are very, very important elements.
Wonderful. And I think I can share you're working also, you're connected with the Dalai Lama and other people in that domain that are sort of seeing some overlap, right?
I am honored to not just meet the Dalai Lama, but to have a one-on-one conversation with him at his place in India in late October, which is an extraordinary honor. And so that is going to be amazing, of course. And yeah.
Wonderful. Ananya Shet, are you there? Can you ask your question on methods?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks everybody. Thank you, David. Just for everyone's benefit, I had the chance to speak to David at last year's Academy of Management. I'm a student at Purdue University.
Now I remember that.
Yeah, and I got influenced by a lot of the conversations we had and read up a lot about evolutionary biology and even cultural evolution. The one thing that I have been struggling with since then, and my PhD topic is now kind of taking focus on how enterprises can be resilient, given that they are complex adaptive systems. So I am from an engineering background, and I do understand methods in complex adaptive systems, complex networks, but I find it difficult to place bets on case methods or case-based methods because there's always a chance to find that one other case which can counter everything that you've understood from one company example. And this speaks to a broader point, which I feel is about methods in organizational behavior, which in comparison to those of evolutionary studies, how do they reconcile? And in your observation, have you seen some that that seem to be very beneficial or can be pursued?
So let me summarize your questions. One is like we need to go beyond case studies. Is that right?
That's one of the things. Can we go beyond case studies, and if so, how?
Right. So let's just focus on that one for the moment. There is a need to go beyond case studies. There's a broader literature on that, which shows that single case studies, even if you quantify them a lot, you do pre-tests and post-tests and all that kind of stuff, actually is very weak evidence. If you have a single case and then you do something and things get better, well, you actually don't know if it was that thing. There's even such things as regression towards the mean, just pure statistical stuff, which can cause that to take place. And so for that reason, the solution to that is some kind of multi-group design, so that if you're in a position to actually work with multiple groups, and here I think is where this could really take root in the corporate world, because if any corporation that's big enough to be a multi-group organization in its own right, then is in a position to do a proper experimental design. It doesn't have to be a randomized control trial, by the way. That's only one method, and it should not be regarded as the only one. There's all kinds of waitlisted designs and multiple measurement designs and so on. So I think that you do need to go beyond case studies. It's perfectly possible to do so, but it involves working with multiple groups, and often it involves longitudinal design so that you're getting multiple measurements, and you can do such things on off. First we do it, then we don't in a single group. That requires quite a lot of control. Basically, there has to be some sense in which we can prescribe this whole multi-group thing. Corporations are in a good position to do that, and that is like what's needed, because that's different than top-down management. That's different than just saying everyone do this. This is saying we're going to experiment. And we're going to experiment and really do it right with sophisticated design. That's the way top-down should be. Top-down meeting bottom-up. And if there's any organizations that would be enlightened enough to do that, that's one reason I'm excited to work with a giant organization like Ascension, for example, because obviously we could do that in spades if they were oriented. But we have the expertise to advise that, as long as we had some organizations that were willing to partner with us. That would be something that, and on that note, it makes me, this is a conclusion that I've been coming to, talking with Michael and others, when you talk about rethinking the business school curriculum, that should involve this kind of active partnership with business corporations that we're just describing. I mean, it should be combined with rethinking business consultancy, basically, along with rethinking business schools, and those should be joined. Business schools should be actually at the forefront of forming these kinds of relationships and engaging their faculty and their students in this kind of experimental or evolutionary approach.
Great, thank you. Scott Jeffrey, you had a number of comments and questions. Are you on? Can you unmute yourself and ask? Scott? No, we're going to take a comment from PJ Dillon. PJ, are you able to? Oh, Scott is up. Scott, are you able to share your comments and question? Okay. PJ, are you able to ask your question? And then we'll see if Scott can come back on.
Okay, great. Hi, David. Thank you.
Oh, PJ, hello. We have a bit of static there.
That's okay. So my quick question was really about how you define flourishing and well-being from an evolutionary standpoint, based on your experiences and your research and what you've done. So I was interested to know a little bit more about flourishing.
Right. In our work with pro-social, which is our practical method for working with all kinds of groups, there's a big psychological tension, and when we measure it, we're measuring some group parameters, but we're also measuring our some individual psychological parameters. And one point to make, really super important point to make, is that we are such a groupish species that natural human social environment is to live in a small cooperative group, a smaller group of people where you are known for your actions, where you trust the other members of your group, where you're accustomed to helping each other out, and then that provides social resources which then join with resources. So that's the optimum environment for human flourishing, to use your own word. And so the single most important policy prescription is to get people working in that kind of group. That will increase flourishing all by itself. And then the measurable components of that are a sense of meaning, which can be measured. There's a big literature on that. A sense of safety and trust, and something else called psychological flexibility, which turns out a lot of research showing is that is something that's needed, not most of all, because they're all important, but to be flexible is the same as being adaptable. And so often it's the case that at both the individual and group level that we might decide we want to do something, but then of course we find it very difficult to do. That's why every year we make New Year's resolutions and every year we fail to keep them. So how to become more flexible in working towards your valued goals is something that people vary on, and something that can be improved in most people. It's something that we can work on both for individuals and corporations. So to summarize, human flourishing, I think, is optimized when people function in the context of small cooperative groups doing important things. And if you create that kind of social environment, then there'll be a big boost without having to do anything else. That includes elements of safety and trust. And then to become flexible is a little bit like the distinction between being well adapted to your current environment and being adaptable to future environments. So to become flexible is a big part of human flourishing.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to make a quick comment, if I could, about, everything that you just said. I think about incorporating that into actually the classroom, right? Because that's a perfect environment to create a small group working together and create an environment that instills trust and safety. And
it is. Thank you for saying that. The classroom is the perfect setting for this, and one in which you could also do multiple group designs, by the way, no problem. If we had a quorum of people that were interested in teaching these things, and then treating the class as a group. I do this myself, and on the first day, I say, actually, it's not that common to think of a class as a group. A lot of people think of it as just like an interaction between student and the teacher. But what would it mean, so on and so forth, and to turn the class into a group? That's brilliant that you've thought of that, and it's a whole growth area right then and there.
Yeah, and I also think I was thinking about it in terms of, an experiment almost. Because if we can do it in the classroom, that allows us to get us something structured so that then we can take it out into other organizational settings more easily.
Well, I do this in my evolution and sustainability class, but it would work equally well in any kind of business class, where first of all, what you do is you get the class to think of the class as like a group. That requires changes on the part of the teacher, because basically the typical teacher, sage on the stage, lecture-heavy relationship becomes part of the problem when you view it through the lens of the core design principles. That's why so many college courses are so profoundly unsatisfying for so many students. And if you look at some of the most innovative pedagogical techniques, what do they involve? Group work, teamwork, students making a decision on what they're taught, all of these things. So if you actually then reformulate your course to be like that, and then you teach the core design principles and much else in that context, and then those same principles apply to the subject matter of the course. In my case, sustainability, but in your case, management or leadership or whatever. And so you're using the same principles again and again and again across contexts, which is important for domain general learning, for learning to be something that can be transported across domains. So please, this is a really important way for us to move forward.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. And David, if you can share some material on that with us, I know a number of us are meeting in 2 weeks, and including PJ, to think and rethink business education and from those different perspectives. I also want to get to a question from Michael Meeks. Are you up and able to unmute? Michael? Okay, then no, he's not. Then Scott Jeffrey, you said you fixed your microphone. Are you able to make a comment?
I can try.
It does sound like it's not the problem is not fixed yet, Scott. Scott? Okay. Roman, you have some questions and comments. Do you want to unmute yourself now? Otherwise, I would just ask the generic question in terms of going back to business education. What do you think, David, are some of the core pieces, including the classroom setup, I hear, that and maybe the theoretical framework to adopt? What else might be helpful?
Okay.
I don't presume to know. I think that's why it's important to initiate a process and to get a community to decide questions like that. So I'm going to duck that question. Okay. I mean, if I were to think of might be a single thing, I actually no, I don't regard myself as enough of a expert in that area. So what we need to do is but there I think that we do have a problem. I suppose it's a good problem to have, which is a lot of parallel efforts. So I mean, you're assembling a consortium. It's a large one, but
Mm-hmm.
then there's other consortia that are being developed. And there's also single individuals that are all eager. Some of them are already very prestigious. So
Mm-hmm.
my new friend, Charles O'Reilly, is, he's Stanford Business School, and he works with another guy that's at the Harvard Business School. And the thing about those, super prestigious individuals is often it's a little bit difficult for them to join an effort. So I think the way to it's almost like a test of our own ideas that we're dealing at multiple scales. We have to be very ambitious in how we're doing it, and so therefore very inclusive. And we have to keep ownership in some sense because it's important. At the same time, we have to be, something like the principle of subsidiarity. We have to be lower level units that operate in the context of higher level units.
Right.
So the principle of polycentric governance and multi-level selection and so on. We have to be quite mindful about that. So not proprietorial. And I think that, of course, that might be something that's hard in the business world, which so often is proprietorial. I think that just to say one more thing about that something that's emerges very, very strongly as a result of all this is the need for a whole earth ethic. Really, we have to be actions with the welfare of the whole earth in mind and everything else below that. And if we could do that, then a lot of the problems, and when you look at the Leviathan organizations such as Google and Amazon and Facebook and or the major corporations, to have that simple mind shift, that one mind shift, actually, is that we have to be much more systemic in what we're trying to do, not just work towards markets and so on, but to take this more holistic focus. Then all of the amazing technological advances and so on could be turned to good use as opposed to disruptive use. But if we don't do that, then it will be disruptive. I mean, we really have to take on board how profoundly misleading the metaphor of the invisible hand is. It is not the case that lower level entities can just pursue their self-interest and that will benefit the common good. The answer to that is no. And yet centralized planning doesn't work either. So then what? Basically, experimentation with the welfare of the whole earth in mind is the only thing that's going to work. So that's going to be quite a shift for the business mentality, and yet one which is necessary to identify from the beginning and to work towards. Because if you don't actually have that shift, then you're not going to. It's not going to work.
Wonderful, and I see many connections, and I know there are a number of projects going on the same way. I want to give Roman. Roman, is it Roman, or is that?
Excuse me.
Okay, just please briefly your comment or question.
Thank you very much. Well, firstly, my English is a very good Spanish speaking, but I think that is very, very important, Professor, the interdisciplinary thought in the search of another kind of view in business schools. So what do you think about the importance of interdisciplinary talk or complex talk? Thank you very much.
I want to make sure the importance of interdisciplinary and complexity. Is that what you said?
Yes, exactly.
Both are huge. And so to focus on complexity, I've already stated that the reason that centralized planning doesn't work is because our systems are too complex. And so when I write about, I have a book I edited with an economist named Alan Kerman, based on a conference in Germany called the Ernst Strungman Forum, which brought experts together for a 5-day period. And the title of that book is Complexity and Evolution Towards a New Synthesis for Economics. And so really, when we talk about the rock solid scientific foundation that underpins just about everything, it's evolution and complexity, any topic. Complex systems theory is more general than evolutionary theory because it applies to physical systems in addition to living systems. But living systems are such a special subset of complex systems that they need their own theory. So complexity in evolution is the, and who could dispute that? I mean, who could disagree with the fact that evolution and complexity, actually, if we could take that as the foundation and then derive useful prescriptions, policies from that, then there could be no more solid ground. And of course, that has to be interdisciplinary because all of the disciplines rest on that foundation. When I talk about this, I talk about, again, with evolution and sustainability. I begin by saying, so here we have basically, and this is true for economics and business as well. Everything is going to come down to a interaction between natural systems and human systems. So, I mean, our economy is going to be based on nature. So, the physical world and the natural world is, and then all of that's going to take place through human systems. So this is coupled natural and human systems is the buzz for that. So what's being brought to bear upon them? An alphabet soup of disciplines, from A to Z of disciplines, is being brought to bear upon these coupled natural and human systems without reference to each other. And so what's needed is unifying theoretical framework that all of these disciplines can become integrated into. So it is like the ultimate in interdisciplinarity, and complexity is at the heart of it. That's what's needed. And I want to say it's taking place. There's already a sizable community, I think, that is thinking in this mode, and so I think that's a very optimistic thing to be able to say. Is we're not really talking about the future, we're talking about the present for a sizable community that's actually begun to think in this mode, and so it's a matter of expanding that community with the business and management field being, somewhat of a newcomer. There's other topics that have been a little bit further along this process, but business and management could become a part of it, is to a degree. I could count, this is the social network that I've been talking about, that I've been building up on my end. There might be 30, 50, 100 of them. That's a pretty large number, but a tiny, tiny fraction, of course, of the entire community. So something which already exists but needs to be expanded, and that expansion needs to be catalyzed so that it takes place in a matter of years and not decades. So I love the idea of catalysis, the idea that the rate of a reaction can be greatly accelerated. Can be true for culture in addition to chemistry.
Wonderful. It's the hour, so thank you very much, David, for your time. It's wonderful. There are lots more questions and lots more suggestions, and I think some people are also sharing the networks that they're part of. Jim Stoner is working on a network of 40 business schools. We have a network that includes the Jesuit Business School Network, Catholic School Business Network, some of the United Nations networks as well. So we're going to talk more. If you want to be in touch, please let us know. Become a member of the International Humanistic Management Association. Come to the pre-conference at the Academy. We have a number of sessions at the Academy of Management. David, you will be there as well. Right? Mm-hmm. And so thank you all for being here. This is to be continued. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
David, do you have time to just debrief briefly after?
Yes, I do.